Welcome to the second Railroads in Native America gathering. Given our virtual interactions in recent years, it's not lost on me how special it is to be here in person with all of you physically today. Thank you so much for traveling to be here to join in this really important conversation, and for those of you joining virtually, welcome as well. We gather today on the territory of the Northwestern Band of Shoshone Nation. And yesterday, many of us were fortunate enough to attend the field trip with Shoshone Elder Rios Pacheco and to take in the wisdom of Darren Perry at our first keynote address. And I think those two experiences really gave a lot of us a stronger sense for what those words mean, to be on the lands of the Northwestern Shoshone. Many thanks to Rios and to Darren, who brought us into deeper understanding of Shoshone past and presence in this place. In addition to the Northwestern Band of Shoshone, we must also acknowledge the 7 tribal nations who have been living, working, and residing in this region since time immemorial. These tribes are the Confederated Tribes of the Goshoot Indians, Navajo Nation, Ute Indian Tribe, Paiute Indian Tribe of Utah, San Juan Southern Paiute, Skull Valley Band of Goshoot, and White Mesa Band of the Ute Mountain Ute. On behalf of the entire steering committee, we would like to extend our thanks for their support of this event. Now, several people in the room today were on the receiving end of a flurry of emails from me in recent weeks, so they know me quite well in that context. But for those of you who do not know me, my name is Alessandra LaRocca Link. I am on the Railroads in Native America Steering Committee, and I co-chair the program committee with Dr. Farina King, who will be presenting later today. I am a historian by training, and I have been researching, thinking, and writing about this topic for several years now. My book project, The Iron Horse in Indian Country, Native Americans, and Railroads in the U.S. West, explores railroads as both a tool of U.S. colonialism and as a site of indigenous resistance and resilience. This book has benefited greatly from the insights and wisdom and work of several individuals in this room today, and I look forward to continuing to expand my own understanding of this complex and fraught topic today and tomorrow. A little background on this event. It was partly because of my research and writing in this field that Patricia LaBounty, the curator of the Union Pacific Railroad Museum, reached out to me in 2018 to discuss the prospect of holding a gathering that centered indigenous stories and perspectives. As many of you probably know, 2019 marked the 150th anniversary of the Union of Transcontinental Tracks in Promontory, Utah, just 50 or so miles, I believe, north of where we are today. I jumped at the prospect to work in partnership with tribal community members and other stakeholders to produce an event that we hoped offered a space for frank conversation and, if we were lucky, for some healing. The 2019 gathering in Omaha, Nebraska served as what I like to call a counter commemoration of sorts, a meeting that looked and felt decidedly different from the 150th Golden Spike anniversary celebrations taking place in and around Utah. A few months after that event, I had the pleasure of meeting Brad Westwood, Utah's senior state public historian, at the Western History Association conference. And I think it was there that the seed was planted for moving this gathering to Utah, right? A place with a rich and long and dynamic and contentious relationship involving railroads and indigenous peoples, and I'm really looking forward to exploring those relationships here today. And for those of you who know Brad, you know that once he gets an idea in his head, there's no, as railroad folks would say, there's no getting him off the track. He immediately put us in contact with the great James Toledo and the Utah Division of Indian Affairs. And after meeting with Utah tribal leaders, the project was greenlighted. And to spare you a lot of the details that go into planning these things, here we are today. The goals of this gathering, the goal of this gathering, rather, is deceptively simple: to join in a community with shared purpose. What is that shared purpose? To reflect on, assess, and account for the dynamic and complex relationships between Native peoples and railroads. We have a remarkably diverse and talented group of presenters this year, including representatives from several Native nations. Panels will explore a wide range of topics, from the role of railroads in perpetuating colonial violence and Indigenous dispossession, to the many ways in which Indigenous peoples use the railroads to resist, to organize, and to protect kin and community. I want to note a choice word for this event: gathering. The steering committee chose that word purposefully. This is not an academic conference, though many fantastic academicians are here and will be presenting and sharing their work. This is a place to open up sorely needed public dialogue about this topic. Everyone here today is a participant in these conversations, and I invite you to dive in and take advantage of the Q&A portion of each session. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our many sponsors. And bear with me, the list is a little long, but I think it reflects sort of, just the strength of the support from the community here. Our sponsors include the Utah Department of Cultural and Community Engagement, the museums at Union Station, Ogden Union Station, the Union Pacific, Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail, Golden Spike National Historic Park, the Hal R. and Naoma J. Tate Foundation, the Union Station Foundation, the National Parks Service, the Union Pacific Railroad Museum, BYU's Red Center, BYU's Library, the Church History Library, the Union Pacific Council on Native American Heritage, the Utah State Historical Society, the University of Utah Department of History, the University of Utah Mormon Studies Initiative, the BYU Department of History, who has really small text on their image here, the Utah Westerners, the Utah Humanities, the Natural History Museum of Utah, the J. Willard Memorial Library at the University of Utah, the American West Center at the University of Utah, the Mountain West Center at Utah State University, and the Buffalo Bill Center of the West. Could we just take a moment and thank these sponsors, please? At this moment, I'd also like to invite all members of the steering committee to please stand. We need to give them our thanks for all of the work that went into creating this event. And lastly, I just want to invite you during our breaks to take advantage of the wonderful vendors we have just outside of this room. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce a fellow member of the Railroads and Native America Steering Committee, Dr. Francie Lynn Taylor, the chair of our first session. Thank you.
Good morning. Alito Achimnakja. I am Kasehosit Chico Kapar Escoyo, also known as Francie Taylor. And I'm really excited to be here this morning. I always thank everyone for presenting a land acknowledgement. However, I always also want to stress that far too often land acknowledgements are placed in the past, and this is totally incorrect because those people, like the Northwestern Band Shoshone, who have this as their ancestral homeland, it is also their contemporary homelands. And we all must always remember that those ancestral homelands, those ancestral people, ancestors are still here today. This should always be placed in the present. When we're talking about history, it's interesting. I'm an anthropologist. I'm that odd American Indian anthropologist and archaeologist. And I'm always confused as to why history is broken up into prehistory and history. What shows why we're here today is to give voice to the other side of the story. The indigenous people here have always had a history, they have always had a presence, and it continues on. And it's high time in an era and a state where we officially celebrate Pioneer Day, but don't officially support and celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day. So with that, my little political statement, I would like to give as much time to our panelists as possible. I would like everybody to remember that this is a conversation. It's not just a dialogue or one-sided, so we're leaving time for you to be able to engage. Our first presenter, unfortunately, was unable to be here in person today, so it will be via a video display, and that is Elliott West. Elliott West is a distinguished professor of history emeritus at the University of Arkansas. He is a specialist in the social and environmental history of the American West and American Indians. He has twice been chosen as his university's Teacher of the Year, and in 2009, he was one of the 3 finalists for the Robert Foster Cherry Prize for the Outstanding Classroom Teacher in the entire nation. He's written 8 highly recognized books, including The Contested Plains, Indian Gold Seekers, and the Rush to Colorado from 1998. However, I think the best introduction I could give is by quoting what Richard White said, referring to West as the best historian of the American West writing today. And with that, I will turn it over to our technology people so they can show you his presentation.
Hello, this is Elliott West. I am recently retired at the Department of History at the University of Arkansas. I'm coming to you from Fayetteville, Arkansas, on the edge of the mighty Ozarks. I want to begin by apologizing that I'm not able to be there in person as I had hoped to be. I went to the first symposium in Omaha and thoroughly enjoyed it. And I had really hoped to attend this one as well, to take part in this one. But things happened, something came up, and I'm unable to be there. So my apologies, please. But I'm happy to provide a tape of this. Hopefully that will add something to the program, and will perhaps encourage some discussion. Unfortunately, that I will not be able to take part in. But anyway, I hope it is of some use. What I'd like to do in this presentation is to look at one of the most common impressions that we have had from the time of the construction of the Union Pacific up until now about that event, to question that impression. To what extent is it correct and not so? And then to pursue some questions around the answers to that question, whether it's accurate or not. The impression I'm talking about is the one that the impression that the construction of the railroad was consistently and vigorously opposed by Indian peoples, in particular the Western Sioux, Lakotas, and Cheyennes, in particular Northern Cheyennes. This is an impression that's been there from the very beginning. Certainly it's part of popular culture, as we see in this poster from John Ford's silent classic, The Iron Horse. It was there at the time. Reporters covered the construction of the railroad quite closely, and they consistently told when there were constant raids by Indians threatening the lives of railroad workers, like here. This was from Harper's Weekly, Others appeared like this, illustrations like this to accompany those stories. There was a newspaper that was published along the route as following the Union Pacific as it was built into Wyoming, the Frontier Index. There's the banner from it. You notice some rather interesting and appalling political opinions here in the masthead. The Frontier Index consistently gave all sorts of rumors of attacks, imminent attacks by Indian peoples and attacks nearby on settlers. It was just the pages are filled with that. The person in charge in constructing the Union Pacific, Grenville Dodge, in his memoirs, told of many deadly assaults on railroad workers, one of which threatened him. He tells of being out looking for a pass through the area of Wyoming, the state of Wyoming, being attacked by a large party of Sioux. And his men were able to save themselves by retreating, but saved by the cavalry literally coming over the hill to rescue them. And Dodge followed up that story by saying that he was able to, in this pursuit, that he stumbled across this pass that was essential for the railroad to find its way through this particular part of Wyoming. So, and this was testified by others as well. Silas Seymour, who was an official in the Union Pacific, told of Indians resisting the construction, as he put it, foot by foot, inch by inch. These brutal, low Indians, natives, he said, were doing this. All of this then has been perpetuated in modern scholarship. You see this in some of the most respected books. For example, A Great and Shining Road by a man named Williams, White Williams, talks about groups of Indians attacking the workers, sometimes as few as 20, often sometimes as many as 2,000, and on a few occasions said many thousands of Indians swooping down on these construction crews. David Bain and Empire Express, which is a highly regarded history of the Union Pacific, uses these as chapter titles. You can tell from the chapter titles what these chapters are about. On top here, if we can save our scalps until they are severely punished, referring to Indians, and they all died with their boots. Well, to what extent is that true? Is that correct? Not much. As it turned out, when you look more closely at these claims, there's really not that much to it. Dodge, for example, his claim of being pursued by this large party of Indians and finding this pass is completely fabricated. An article way back in 1965 by Wallace Farnham in the Journal of American History totally debunked this. Turned out that it never happened. It could not have ever happened then when Dodge said it happened. And furthermore, the pass that he claims to have discovered was discovered a good bit later by someone else. If you look more closely at the Frontier Index, you see that these are only rumors that they were talking about. There is no verifiable accounts of deadly assaults on workers by Indians. What we see that, and especially if we look in particular when we get down, get down to the trenches and look at the most obvious source of evidence, that is military records. All of these claims that I've talked about so far, including the most modern, most recent claims, neglected to do that. One obvious place they should have looked, and it's what the Army was saying, they didn't. And when you do that, and these, of course, every one of the posts along this route were sending dispatches, frequent dispatches back, and they've been saved they're in the National Archives and accessible to all of us. And if you look at these reports, what you see is that, with a couple of exceptions that I'll mention in a moment, there's really nothing there of the kinds of concerted opposition and raiding and deaths at the hands of Indians that were reported by so many and so vigorously. There were plenty of raids, that is sort of hit and run raids by young men who were stealing livestock primarily. That, of course, is what young men in these cultures did. That's how they sort of began to make their bones, to build their reputations. In the past, it had been raiding other Indian groups, to stealing horses. Now they were stealing cattle and horses and oxen from these railroad crews. Plenty of rumors, once again. There's a sighting of this Indian, of a bunch of Indians over here. There's a sighting of a bunch of Indians over there, escorting of mail coaches back and forth. But in terms of those deadly raids, no, very little there, with two exceptions. There were two areas in which some serious violence took place. Where? One, a place called Plum Creek Crossing. Now that's right down here. It's west of then Fort Kearney, now Kearney, Nebraska, and east of North Platte, right down through here, Plum Creek Crossing. This was the site of probably the most famous of these violent incidents during these times in August of 1867, when a small group of Cheyenne men managed to derail a handcar and a locomotive and to kill a couple of men there, to loot it, and to steal material there, and to run away with it. The second area was to the west of that, over here, west of Julesburg, Colorado today, between Julesburg and the Wyoming border, right down through here, along a stream known as called Lodgepole Creek. Apart from that, however, there was very little evidence of this sort of anything remotely resembling this kind of determined, consistent opposition. Why? This raises, I think, three questions. Why was this the case? What were the Indians thinking? What were they doing? Excuse me. What were they doing? What was their strategy? What were they thinking? Secondly, why do these events occur in these two particular places and nowhere else? And the third question is, what are we to make of this? Why has this impression, this myth, been held to so strongly over so long? Well, first question: what sort of Indian strategy? What strategy can we see the Lakotas and the Cheyennes apparently adopting? What I suggest to you is that they had essentially conceded the Platte Valley, the former Overland Trail. They had given up on it. This goes back to events after the first Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, in which they agreed to allow the passage of overlanders, agreed to allow the construction of military posts along the route. This lasted, however, only about 3 years, until what's called the Grattan Massacre, or the Grattan episode, where a young Lieutenant Grattan confronted a bunch of Lakota right outside of Fort Laramie. Fighting broke out, and Grattan and all of his men were killed. In response to this, the Army sent this man, William Harney, later known by the Lakotas as Mad Bear, to inflict some pain in reprisal for this. Harney led his command against a Menoconjou camp at a place called Blue Water Creek near Ash Hollow today. This is what's called a massacre tree, a gigantic cottonwood at the site of Blue Water Creek. He inflicted terrible pain, terrible losses on the Menoconjous. About 85 were killed, more than 70 women and children were captured, taken into captivity. And Harney followed up with that with a march with his men squarely through Lakota country to the north, up to the Missouri River to found Fort Pierre. What seems to have happened from this is that the Northern Cheyennes and the Lakotas took the lesson from this, that they could no longer hold on to, they could no longer oppose the white presence along the Platte River. So they just sort of gave it up. The Brules, that one part of the Sioux, remained along the Platte. All the rest of them, however, withdrew up into this country up here, known as the Powder River and the Tongue River country to the north, rich hunting grounds. And there they said, okay, we'll pull back here, but that's it. We will hold on to this. So what they said, in effect, that you guys win with the Platte, the Overland Trail, including now the construction of the railroad. It's yours. It's yours. However, this shows up in a council between the so-called Peace Commission in 1868 and some Lakota leaders when the leaders said, in effect, and it's in the record, we have no problem with you on this road, they call it, that is on the Overland Trail and now the construction of the railroad. But as long as you stay there, we're okay. But do not, we are adamantly opposed to you making any move to the north of this, up into the Powder River country, or to the south of this, down into what's today central Kansas, along the Smoky Hill River. That's our territory. That's our territory. And we're going to hold on to it, and we will oppose any attempt that you make to move into this area. Singing along with the Who, we won't be fooled again. So that, I think, explains why there was so little of this concerted opposition to the construction of the railroad, as the popular impression would have it. The second question is, why then did it happen where it did? What is it about those two places that explain the opposition there? The first place, as I mentioned, Plum Creek Crossing. It's down here in Dawson County, right along through here. Plum Creek Crossing was the traditional crossing place of the Platte between the Northern Cheyennes and the Southern Cheyennes, and the Lakotas would use, moving back and forth across this river. That's where they crossed. They would move. It was an easy crossing. The Plum Creek flowed into it from the north, and there were other watersheds to the south that were easily traversed. This led down to, if you look down here in Red Willow County, down here close to the border, where you see the town of McCook. This is along the Republican River, and this is the site of what we call the Big Timbers of the Republican. This is a great camping place for the winter for them. And the Republican River was rich in bison during those years. So this is good hunting ground, a good place to camp. And if you're up here and you're coming down there, this is where you cross. This is where you cross. So I think the incidents that occurred there occurred because in happenstance, young groups of young men crossing there would run into some whites, that perhaps working on the railroad or not, and then they would take advantage of that, and they would try to sort of earn their reputation or bolster their reputation by assaults. But that was also the place, as I said before, of the derailment of the Union Pacific in late summer of 1867. I don't have time to go into discussion of that, but let me just make the point here that to me, if you look closely at that episode, it's an apparent exception that really proves the rule. Second area where they opposed it was up here along Lodgepole Creek. And here, I should say the violence and the deaths here were far greater than over there at Plum Creek, and by far the greatest of along here. More people killed, more soldiers killed, settlers killed in this area than all the rest of the area combined. Why? What was it about that particular place? Well, to state the obvious, the railroad here was breaking the rules. The understanding was that they were to stick with the Platte Valley, stick with the Overland Trail, and that went up here. But they didn't. For engineering reasons, they needed to go down in this direction, which was easier to get across and a lower pass there. So they were deviating from this, and they were entering area that the Sioux said, you cannot go. You cannot go. Furthermore, this was resource rich. It's called Lodgepole Creek because this is a great source of lodgepoles that they would need throughout the year. The third reason, this is especially important, I think, is that this area through here was being used after 1866 as a staging ground for those who were heading up via the Bozeman Trail up into the gold and silver camps up here in Montana. This was the site of the famous Red Cloud's War that was being fought just about this same time. So what the Sioux were saying here is, this is not only down through here, you're not only breaking the rules and entering country you're not supposed to go into, you're not only entering a country that we have to have for our resources, you are facilitating an entry into this early stage, this early leg of this trail that we will not permit. This goes up then to this Powder River country, Tongue River country. This is exactly where they said you must not go. And of course, we know that they opposed it there in Red Cloud's War, and eventually the army backed off. So the third question: why do we insist then on holding to this notion? I think there are a few reasons. In the first place, stories of Indian attacks sell newspapers. And they sell books. So there was a sort of natural appeal during this period for journalists like Henry Morton Stanley, who was out there reporting all of this before he went to Africa to presume to find Dr. David Livingstone. I think it's true throughout the West that you often found local settlers and townspeople pumping up these stories of Indian assaults and Indian threats in order to bring soldiers out there, the military out there, which meant good business. It meant money for them. So there are a couple of reasons. I think there was a third reason that was, I think we need to pay attention. This is naturally speculative, of course. But I think that the construction of the Union Pacific, the construction of this first transcontinental was serving a mythic purpose during these years after the Civil War. After the Civil War, we needed stories that would bind the North and the South together. They would provide a kind of a unifying story, a unifying myth. And the construction of the railroad was exactly what the doctor ordered. Here was something, this great enterprise that all Americans in the East, whether they're from the North or from the South, whether they're from South Carolina or they're from Maine, could take pride in and to identify with. So this was seen as this great national unifying mythic project. But a great mythic project requires mythic opposition. You need villains in this story. You need people who are going to oppose it so that you can overcome those people, overcome these obstacles, and prove your stuff, earn it. So I think this is it's useful for us to take stories and impressions like that of this Indian opposition and to look at them more closely. I think it can help us understand this whole process much better. In particular, this one, I think what this teaches us is that Western Indians, in this case the Lakotas and the Cheyennes, were very shrewdly assessing and analyzing their situation and coming up with strategies that would fit most snugly what they needed and what was going on. These were not your sort of mindless savages opposing whites because whites were coming in. This was part of a concerted, thought out process. And it's one that tells us a lot about the abilities of these Indian peoples to think through their situation. And it's also one that tells us about this emerging national myth in which the Union Pacific played such a critically important role. Well, again, thank you. I wish I could be there with you. I hope you have a great time there. I'm sure you will. And I hope if there's a third one, I will certainly do my very best to attend that. Goodbye and God bless.
Can you set it so they can do that? You must forgive my lack of techniness. We need to set up for the next slides. As we're setting up, I'd like to introduce Larry Cesspooch, a member of the Ute tribe. He is a Vietnam veteran, a contemporary storyteller, musician, and filmmaker. In his presentations, he shares Ute wisdom, language, and the Ute creation story. He grew up on the Uinta and Ouray Ute Reservation in northeastern Utah, where he and his family now maintain one of the tribe's sweat lodges. Larry, whose Ute name is Cesspooch, means young man. He studied photography at the prestigious Institute of American Indian Arts and Filmmaking at the Anthropological Film Center. Larry's multimedia storytelling features artifacts, music, with traditional and contemporary instruments. He shares his Ute knowledge with audiences of all cultures. He created the Ute Tribe Audiovisual, one of the first tribal production groups in the United States, which has produced over 600 films on Ute culture, language, and history, including the Ute Bear Dance story. In 2002, he established his own production studios through Native Eyes Productions. He remains one of the Ute spiritual leaders, frequently delivering talks about spirituality and specific Ute cultures. He is also presenting with Liz Walker, who is working on a book called How the West Was Done, and it's about the collusion and conspiracy between railroads, the government, and the early Ute treaties. And as a reminder of every treaty that the United States signed with American Indian people, they managed to break every single one. So it's a great honor to welcome Larry and Liz to the podium.
Mike, Suwaipanike, Ivedunike, Northwest Shoshone, Nunavut. Good morning. It's good to see everybody here today, to be here on this Northwest Shoshone's land and to see all my Shoshone friends, and give a shout out to Rio, who made my son's dance outfit. Haven't seen him for a long time. Our presentation is called The Shortest Route Through Ute Country. It will talk about how treaties were affected by the railroad. In my bio, it talks about YouTube. It's one of my projects I'm working on now. Not YouTube, but YouTube. And it's youtube.org. And it will have all of our Ute Tribe's photo archive, as well as film and video and history. We have a page now, but it's pretty much about the tribal organization. But this will get into our history and, of course, show all of those visuals. As was said, I'm a filmmaker. So I think our Native people, we pretty much operate on the right brain where visuals and audio work best for us. And so film is just the right tool to use. This morning when I was sleeping, it must have been about 4 o'clock, I started to hear train whistles, and they woke me up. Where I live on the reservation is up in Neola. It's a small town out there on the res, and it's about 3.5 hours away from here over the Wasatch Mountains. And everything here at home is very quiet, and being a vet, I can wake up real quick because I'm real sensitive to sounds and such. But that railroad whistle woke me up this morning, and I'm thinking that must have been how it was for our Ute people when they had no knowledge of what was coming with this train. And to hear that sound and to feel that rumble. Our Ute word for train is kasi mugwe, kasi mugwe. And it talks about a big rumble. And so that's how they described the train. Our Ute people were pretty content and lived a good life. We didn't have any invaders except the Spanish who came in with the horse. And we were the first to acquire that Mustang. And of course, Utah is named after our Ute people. But we had a pretty simple life going. Everything was simple. Life was hard. Life is hard for any Native person if you live that way. I take care of that sweat lodge, and that's my baby. I'm always having to take care of it just like a child, and to have to go get your food every day to be able to eat and to live off the land wasn't easy for our people. As I said, we acquired the horse from the Spaniards when they came to Santa Fe and were looking for a route to California. A Ute guide brought them through the Uinta Basin out here to Utah Lake, and eventually they made the route for the Spanish Trail down to California. Our bands were situated as such. I'm of the Yampatka that was up in northern Colorado, and they were pretty much the ones that were affected by the railroad when it came. And so from this point on, I'm going to have Liz Walker, my friend and associate, to take it from here to explain the railroad. Her family has been in the railroad business a number of generations, and she knows the ins and outs. So at this time, Liz.
Thank you, Larry. Larry asked me to participate in this gathering and presentation because I am working on a book about the collusion and conspiracies between the railroads, the government, and the Ute Indian treaties. And even though most of it is about the Ute Indians, it includes many more tribes and railroads. Someone once said that half of writing history is hiding the truth. The problem with the history of railroads in Native America is being able to see events in their true context, and which right now in history as written is nearly impossible without seeing everything else originally connected to it. Native American history is written without data on the railroad's role in Indian treaties and all the defective boundary surveys by government surveyors that followed. And railroad history is written without data on government land grant surveys and all the boundary fights over reservation lands still claimed and occupied by the Indians. But as we all know, history is usually written by the winners. With many of our state historical societies established and state histories written by individuals still connected to the railroads themselves. This slide, in 1850, the government passed the Railroad Land Grant Act in order to help the railroads with construction costs. Then in 1853, the Railroad Surveys Act was passed, funding reconnaissance and surveys across 5 separate routes. The routes spanned 5 separate parallels across the United States to the Pacific coast. Contemporary railroad history in relation to Native America is mostly about the final transcontinental railroad routes completed to the west, but not much is written about the proposed railroad routes on paper that railroad and land speculators believed they could build, with many of those railroads on paper being responsible for inducing the early Indian treaties in the first place. In the 1850s, 2 main routes were proposed to go through Ute territory. It was the North Fork of the Platte River and the Cochitopa route. The first, in 1855, the Abiqui treaties with the Southern Ute released all their claim to lands in New Mexico in exchange for a reservation along the Chama River, which never materialized. During the same time period, in Kansas territory, the Leavenworth, Pawnee, and Western was awarded permission to build to the western edge of Kansas territory, which was the front range of the Rocky Mountains, Denver. This is a map showing Kansas territory and the Leavenworth, Pawnee, and Western from Leavenworth, Kansas, following the Arkansas River, and then dipping down into New Mexico, where the Southern Utes had just released their claim, and going past Fort Massachusetts and over Cochitopa Pass into Utah territory. In 1858, after gold is discovered in the Pikes Peak region, railroad and land speculators that were concentrated in Omaha split, with many of them moving to Denver City. with a renewed focus of now bringing the proposed railroad from Omaha directly through Denver and west into the mountains to Utah, with Ute homelands and hunting grounds in both Colorado and Utah now being in the path of everything. In 1862, the Union Pacific is chartered in Chicago, with Governor John Evans also serving as a Union Pacific Railroad Commissioner for the District of Colorado. He was also an incorporator. There's lots written about Governor John Evans and his culpability at Sand Creek, but there is nothing really written about him, what he did to the Utes. In 1863, the Conejos Treaty with the Tabawatch cleared claims for everything outside their Elk Mountain Reservation. The top orange part is the Uinta Reserve, and then the bottom part is the Elk Mountain Reserve. And in 1863 also, the LP&W became the Union Pacific Eastern Division, and it was reconfigured. The blue line going through goes directly west of Denver, through Middle Park, and then into Utah. And this is a view from Lookout Mountain, west of Buffalo Bill's grave, towards Berthoud Pass. In 1866, the Middle Park Treaty cleared the right-of-way for the northern Ute. This is a sketch by Charles Stobie. He was a mountain man that painted the Utes. And on the other side is a picture. Took me a couple years, but I found the exact spot that he did the drawing from. And this is Charles Stobie. In 1867, the final decision was made for the Union Pacific Railroad to build north of Colorado, bypassing Colorado. So the Union Pacific Eastern Division was now the main railroad into Colorado. Also in 1867, Colorado's gold and minerals won gold medals at the Paris Expo, putting Colorado and her gold on the international stage. And this is in 1867, there were still buffalo herds on the plains, and the government gave the buffalo hunters free ammo. And also in 1872, Buffalo Bill received the Congressional Medal of Honor for annihilating the buffalo. And then in 1869, the Union Pacific meets the Central Pacific at Promontory. Which is kind of ironic because William B. Ogden, an original incorporator and first president of the Union Pacific Railroad, was a distant cousin of Hudson Bay fur trapper Peter Skeen Ogden, the namesake of Ogden, Utah. And that is it. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry and Liz. That was amazing. Our final presenter this morning, before we open it up for questions, is Dr. Jennifer Graber. She is a professor of religious studies and associate director of Native American and Indigenous Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. She teaches and researches on North American religions, including Native American religions in the 19th century. Her latest book, Gods of Indian Country, Religion and the Struggle for the American West, considers religious transformation among the Kiowa Indians and the Anglo-Americans during their conflict over Indian Territory, or what is now known as Oklahoma. It's where my tribal headquarters are. Her new project, Our World Renewed, focuses on Native actor and sources and epistemologies in the ghost dance of 1870 and 1890. Dr. Graber.
There we go. Good morning. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here, and thanks to all of you who are here. I want to thank the organizers and especially the Native elders who were a part of planning and bringing this process and this conference together. Today I want to share with you some work in progress. It's a project I hope will be an Indigenous-focused, student-friendly book on the ghost dance of 1870 and 1890. And I'm writing it because I think we need it. I can't overstate how bad the accounts are of the ghost dance in most books that are about the history of American religion. They are full of inaccurate statements, but also rationalize, I would say, the American violence, especially against ghost dancers, Lakota ghost dancers at Wounded Knee. I feel like we need something else. And you can't talk about the ghost dance without talking about railroads. So I've been reading about railroads, including studies that emphasize the railroad's role in modernizing the United States. And that has sometimes included arguments that railroad use, among other things, also modernized Native people. Associations between the railroad and Native progress abound, and I'll show you just one example. This is a silent film made in the 1940s to promote Methodist missions in Indian country. So I'm going to show you a few stills. Imagine quavering organ music. So here we have the first frame. The Board of Missions presents Paiute. And they basically set this silent film in the Methodist missions at Walker River and in the Yarrington colony. But what they also do is emphasize that one of the successes of this mission is that Indian men work on the railroad. And they feature images of Paiute men working. And a number of them are devoted members of the Methodist Church. And so one of the things the film really pulls together is that railroad work, church, new homes, particular forms of child rearing, all are making the Paiute modern. This emphasis on making Indians modern and the railroad's role in it troubles me, because it seems like another example of the ways non-Indigenous categories can obscure more than they reveal. But all is not lost. There has been great recent scholarship, including by people in this room, on the ways that Native people used railroads for their own people's benefit, in which the railroad was a tool of survivance, self-determination, and a defense of sovereignty. And I want to try to contribute to this effort with my own skill set as a historian and a scholar of North American religions. And so I returned to the sources, the ghost dance sources, including the massive report written by ethnologist James Mooney in the 1890s after his many visits across Indian country. He visited Wovoka, the Paiute leader of the ghost dance, on the Walker River Reservation or nearby. And then he returned to the Cheyenne and Arapaho Reservation, where he was greeted eagerly and was asked for these things. He says, "My visitors would ask to see the things which I had brought back from the Messiah," another imported category, right? And these gifts that he brought back from Wovoka to the people on the Cheyenne and Arapaho Reservation included rabbit skin robes, pinyon nuts, gaming sticks, sacred magpie feathers, and above all, the sacred red paint. So the railroad carried not only ghost dance pilgrims, it carried ghost dance objects. And this movement of materials via the railroad allowed physical contact for those who never got to meet Wovoka in person. So I began to map the movement of these various materials, particularly this list of objects that Mooney made that he said generated such a response among Cheyenne and Arapaho. And the maps that I started to make looked a lot like railroad maps, but they also reflected much older forms of movement, walking paths traversed by humans, rivers navigated by canoes, and later trade routes expanded by the arrival and use of horses. So ghost dance materials moved on the railroad in a way that reflected this long history of intertribal visitation, dance, trade, communication, which included the trade and experience with one another of religious ceremonies. And this began to make me think about the railroad differently, pulling me out of a narrative in which the railroad modernizes. And I began to see the railroad as one of the ways Native people acted to make their lives better. And to be sure, these were future-minded, but not necessarily fixed on progress, as they were also anchored in tradition and sometimes even in myth. So moving ghost dance materials on the railroad was not, as opposed to the Euro-Americans behind the project, about domination, expansion, or consumption, but rather about extending a life-affirming message to everyday Native people throughout the West. So today I want to talk about just two examples from this list that Mooney made of the gifts he brought from Wovoka: paint and gaming sticks. Paint. Paint was one of the most exchanged ghost dance items. It was used on faces and bodies, and it's best known, I think, by non-natives for its use to create ghost dance shirts and dresses. But I want to think about the other ways that paint signified in Native life. Mooney described that Wovoka's paint was made from elements gathered at important places. He got the red paint from the Twin Sisters area of Mount Grant. And that's important. Paiutes considered Mount Grant to be their place of origin. And it was also the setting for many mythic stories, including one about Badger and a widow who were confronting death. According to the story, Badger painted himself and danced a dance and sang a song known only to himself. And then he dug a hole and burrowed around under the ground until he came to the point just under the bodies, and there he emerged from the earth. Standing by the bodies of the woman and child, he pierced them with his medicine knife until the blood ran, and they returned to life. So the place where Wovoka got his paint and sent it out to others was a place that the Paiutes had long associated with the power to bring people back to life. Mooney also noted how Wovoka spread this paint around to others. He said, quote, "Small portions of it given by Wovoka to all the delegates are then carried back by them to their respective tribes, where it is mixed with larger quantities of their own red paint and used in decorating faces of the participants in the dance." And Mooney witnessed this process when he returned to the Cheyenne and Arapaho reservation. People came to him because they wanted to touch the paint. They would brush their hands against it and put it on their faces and bodies. And then after that, they would go and use their own red paint when they ran out of what Wovoka had brought. Up in Lakota country, Black Elk started with the paint that other ghost dance visitors had brought back from Wovoka, but eventually used pigments gathered from local areas important to the Lakota. He said that paint, whether it was given by Wovoka or coming from their own local sources, directed people on a good road. It oriented them, just like the places where they got the paint from nearby. Ghost dancers mixed Wovoka's paint with their own in some kind of interesting ways as well. A southern Arapaho man named Black Coyote actually traveled hundreds of miles to a traditional paint source in their homelands called, in Mooney's text, the Ancient Turtle River. So this was probably very far north where the Arapaho had once lived, but no longer lived at this time. But Black Coyote wanted to mix the paint from Wovoka with paint from this traditional, powerful place from which they had been removed. Paint also became a way to spread the movement to other Native neighbors. So a Kiowa delegation, led by a man named Patadel, visited the Cheyenne and Arapaho and brought back, quote, a quantity of the sacred red paint procured originally from the country of the Messiah, end quote. And then Patadel used that paint to initiate Kiowa dancers to start the dance movement on their reservation. And of course, ghost dancers painted shirts and dresses. These painted items also circulated to new people and places. For instance, a Lakota student named Robert High Eagle encountered a shirt when he was at the Standing Rock boarding school. And here's an image of what students at that school would have been wearing day to day at that time. He wrote, "One of the schoolboys had run away, and this boy was gone about a month. But when he came back, everybody crowded around him. He was telling some interesting stories and singing ghost dance songs. He also wore a bulletproof shirt. He got the crowd of boys around, and they began to sing the songs." And that contrast between that shirt and that uniform, I think, is so striking. And here we can see how paint was a way for students to connect to their homes and families. Native people showed interest in Wovoka's paint for many years. They sent him letters asking for paint, and as time went by, those requests really focused on the paint for use in healing. So here's a letter written from Saskatchewan in 1909, right? So a little bit later than we normally think about the ghost dance, asking for paint. And in this case, he acknowledges that Wovoka had actually sent him paint before in tomato cans. So sometimes new and unconventional formats were used. I also found in records of Kiowa material culture that the red paint was sent from place to place in baking powder cans. So these are some of the cans that carried Wovoka's paint. So the railroad carried ghost dance ideas and practitioners, and Wovoka's paint then extended those new connections. Paiute places to new places, Paiute people to new people across the West. But for Native people, giving and receiving paint, it meant more than just preparation for the ghost dance, or as some outside accounts would have it, preparing shirts to be bulletproof. They could be sent as they invoked important places and mythic stories. They could be given as a gift of love to your kin. And so in the end, this material often moved by rail, touched everyday people, people who never got to travel by rail to meet Wovoka. So let me quickly talk about gaming sticks, because the place of gaming sticks within the ghost dance is much less well known, but Wovoka talked about games a lot. For Wovoka, this would have meant objects that looked like this, gaming sticks, used in the basin for various guessing and tallying games, or guessing games that required tallying. And Wovoka promised that upon the renewal of the world, games would come back and be thick everywhere. He said the spirit world also had games, and he gave gaming sticks to visitors and directed them to keep playing games, which I think is important because at this time a lot of reservation agents and missionaries would have been discouraging games because they associated games with immoral gambling. Visitors carried the gaming sticks on the railroad home to their people, and some Native nations made games central to their version of the ghost dance. They combined Wovoka's directive to play games with their own gaming traditions and suit really their own particular circumstances. So I'll just show you the Pawnee example. They long had similar gaming sticks to folks in the basin, so here are some Pawnee gaming sticks. But over the course of their time doing the ghost dance, they really added a bunch of elements. And so some of those sticks ended up looking like this. They became a kind of assemblage. Some people talk about them as a gaming bundle. And they had implements for use in ghost dance attached to the gaming items. So I'll show you some of the items that would be a part of these assemblages. It could include a pipe here in the center, a tamper up on the upper left, drums, horn spoons for feasting afterward, and some of these pictures are withheld by the Museum of the American Indian because they are considered sacred and not to be shared. But they could include altar spreads made of eagle skin or wildcat skin, hair ornaments that had eagle feathers. Sometimes there were gourd or leather rattles, painted clothing. Sometimes you had to play the game in teepees painted with certain designs. So into this beginning with this gaming stick tradition, they added all these elements to bring the practice together. And I'm going to skip one little part here. So how did this come to be? How did we get from a set of kind of plain-looking sticks to more elaborate ones? And it's partly because Pawnees used their mobility to visit ghost dancers at the Cheyenne and Arapaho and the Kiowa Comanche Reservation. And what they saw was a ghost dance that included games. I'm going to actually skip through here. Here we go. This is a hide painting of the Cheyenne and Arapaho dance. It includes lots of elements, including people wearing paint, people dancing, some people who have fallen in a kind of visionary experience. But it also includes games. Some people used gaming apparatus in the ghost dance, but these were not like Wovoka's gaming sticks. They were more attuned to Cheyenne gaming traditions. So the wheel and stick game is on the hide, and also a type of shinny stick. So if we go back here, we can kind of see that the Cheyenne brought in their own game elements, and that's really exactly, and people would also have, I'll go forward, visions of games. So a woman named Moki Left Hand, she's featured here with her husband, she in a vision received a song about games. Her children had passed away, and she considered the spirit world where they lived to be her true home. And so you can see in the song lyrics that she came back with that as she was moving about the spirit world, she saw people using the game wheel. And many other songs are written by Cheyenne and Arapaho women that feature games and sometimes their departed children. So one thing I really like about looking at these material items is that you then get a chance to really see everyday people. So these are some folks who actually began to have, on the Pawnee Reservation, they had new visions, they brought back game songs, they introduced new game things and those very implements into their Pawnee practice. And you could say that the Pawnees integrated the ghost dance into their gameplay because their reservation agent forbid dancing but did allow games. But I also want to emphasize that Pawnee myths also really anchored the combination here. They had long told stories about the afterlife, including games. So I think it's no surprise that they would associate the ghost dance and this renewal of people to games. So I'll say it here at the end. So much of the literature emphasizes the role of the railroad in making American modern, fast, wealthy, and dominant over the country's huge landmass, its peoples and animals. Many Americans also viewed Native engagement with railroads as a sign of their successful civilization. Think back to that movie. But Native people used railroad in ways similar to long-practiced forms of contact and exchange, and also new ways, such as earning wages, to support their families in new circumstances. These travelers brought back many things to their communities, and in the case of the ghost dance, a new visionary message and objects for use in a movement to protect their people, their land, and sovereignty. And so, to my mind, this is not so much a modern story, but a story of an ongoing Indigenous way of being in the world. Thanks.
Let's give all of our presenters another round here. I've learned a lot. I could spend all day with every one of these presenters, so unfortunately we do have time limits. I'd like to open it up now for some questions. And me? Oh, so if you have a question, please come up to the mic. One of the things that I've learned, I liked Elliott's story about the fictitious battle. One of the things I've used in my own teaching is the concept of circle up the wagons. I've even had other professors use that term with me, which is a totally fictitious event. Never happened. I used to ask my classes, do you really think we were dumb enough to come down there and ride around your wagon train? until you picked us off one by one. And have you ever tried to get oxen to move into a circle? I mean, seriously? So anyway, questions?
Okay. Ooh, that was loud. Sorry. Thank you so much for your presentations. I think my question is for Larry in particular. I was interested in hearing, do you have or think of family stories of railroads that have been really impressionable on you? And then second of all, how do Utes today view railroads? I think your opening thoughts from your experience, also being a Vietnam veteran and the impact of hearing railroads even just last night kind of imply some ideas, but that'd be really helpful to also have a sense of how Ute nations think of railroads today and work with them too. But I know those are two different questions, so thank you for your thoughts and sharing.
One thing that comes to my mind is I had a chance to work with LeVan Martin, who was very knowledgeable about rock writing. And we seen one of the panels that had, it must have been the first time our people had seen the railroad. And so in the railroad you had cattle, you had everything that the railroad was bringing. Plus it also was associated with that was a school, a white school. And so I think what the panel was talking about was along with the train came all of these new things that in my mind is assimilation. And it was like they had a mouth and the train was running into the mouth, so it was like ramming it down the throat of our people. And as far as the rumble of trains, I was with an air squadron in Vietnam, and so that rumbling reminds me of just sitting there and ready to take off. We used to have to do cat shots. That's when you're catapulted off of the plane, off the boat carrier, and so you're just sitting there revving at all of these RPMs. And all of a sudden you're released and you go to 3 Gs, from nothing to 3 Gs, and you just paste it back here. But all you remember is just that rattle. And so that's what it all brings back to me.
Thank you. If others have questions, I can help bring the microphone to you so you don't have to run all the way here.
Thank you, Farina. This is a question for Jen. In your research, did you find any specific instances of the railroads providing free transportation to Native Americans?
Yes, so one part that I skipped was that, so the Pawnees, of course, had very early contact with the railroads because the tracks going west from Omaha, Nebraska went through their traditional territory, and they had free rides. And so one of the things that really prepares them to participate in the ghost dance in this way, and Justin Gage's book really shows this well, is that they were already traveling to use the railroad, including times some Pawnees went on a trip to the Kiowa Reservation in 1882 when there was an earlier movement to bring back the buffalo. A sort of prophetic movement there. So they had actually already gone to be a part of ceremonies with other people using the railroad and using free rides. And that really, I think, sets them up not only to visit and exchange ideas, but then they start to move items as well. Thanks.
Are there any other questions people have? Can run to? Oh, go ahead up there at the front. Sorry.
Okay, so we have some questions from the virtual participants. I'm going to share both because they may be a little bit connected. One of them says, for all presenters, how do we give these stories to the public so that they understand this is not revised history, but a complete history they will hopefully accept? And then another question along the same line says, what is the likelihood of introducing a federal bill to designate a National Native American Day, and then suggest that that may be part of the effort to increase knowledge in the community and make that history more accessible to the public?
I'm going to jump in real quick with that one. One thing we need to do, it's not revisionist history, it's accurate history. And the history of American Indian people has to be embedded within the K-12 curriculum. It can no longer be ignored. There isn't a history book that I've seen in recent years that addresses American Indians past 1900. And if they are addressed beyond that, it's a side box. It's not a chapter, it's not a book. And our histories are vast millennium long. We cannot continue to say history began with colonization. It existed before that. And until we can get it into the K-12 curriculum, we're going to be in a deficit model. I had a meeting just this last week with educators, American Indian educators, and several classroom teachers talked about teachers in 2020 sending work home with children in the 4th and 5th, 6th grades on do a story about your immigrant history. When that's handed out to Native students, it shows that we are completely eliminated from the curriculum. And in my opinion, this is grievous and it has to be stopped.
In Liz's book, the only way you could really understand how Ute history happened is to show American history. And when you show them side by side, you could see how things happened and why they happened and the cause of what happened after they happened. So it's not separate and a part of itself. It's integral, and it has to be. And I forgot my other point, but yeah. Is a lot of people speak about things as Native people, as Indigenous, Aboriginal. I think a lot of those, yes, they describe our people, but it also puts us in past tense. Mm-hmm. We're here and we're present now, and we'll always be here.
I also think there's something that we all have to respond to this problem of lack of recognition from our own particular positions. And so one thing because so often so many positions from which people might speak have been obscured in the histories. So one important part of my project is I just got approval to start to interview tribal historians and cultural preservation officers to talk about how they recall the ghost dance or they recall the railroad period in their museum exhibits, in their books, in their curriculum for educating children about tribal history, because those are not a part of many accounts of the ghost dance. It's always this past movement, and it doesn't look at the perspectives of various Native tribal nations who might have their own and really varied stories about whether or not they ghost danced, whether or not that was a good thing for their people. And so for me as a historian and a settler historian in a settler institution, the university, I want to try to get at, I think we can kind of push against some of the models, and you just have to look for other perspectives.
And I agree with Larry, we have to be taken out of history and put into contemporary times. It's about time that every education system in the United States began to speak to us in our own names, in our own languages. Other questions?
I think that's it.
I think we're done. Neesh, papaisiva.